The Roman triumph of 71 CE stood apart from every other celebration in imperial history. As chained prisoners were driven through the streets of Rome, spectators watched an entire people displayed as conquered property. Jewish captives, representatives of a civilization that had dared to defy Roman rule, were marched alongside sacred treasures stolen from their most holy sanctuary. This spectacle was more than a victory parade. It was a public declaration of Rome's deliberate annihilation of Judean sovereignty and the start of a punishment so devastating it would disperse a people across the known world for almost 2 millennia. Brutal siege and total destruction of Jerusalem. In April of 70 CE, Jerusalem was encircled by 4 Roman legions. At their head stood General Titus, son of Emperor Vespasian, commanding no fewer than 48,000 soldiers. The timing was intentional. The siege began just 3 days before Passover, when vast numbers of pilgrims had poured into the city for the sacred festival. A moment meant for worship and celebration became a sealed death trap as Roman forces closed in. Within Jerusalem, internal divisions had already weakened resistance. Rival Jewish factions led by John of Gischala, Simon bar Giora, and Eleazar ben Simon were consumed by infighting, destroying vital food reserves before the Romans even attacked. Only when Roman siege towers rose against the walls did the factions finally unite. Their defense was determined, but ultimately hopeless. The siege progressed with calculated cruelty. Roman engineers erected enormous earthworks, inching closer to the city's defenses day by day. Each fallen wall brought the legions nearer to the Temple Mount. Inside the city, starvation spread rapidly as supplies vanished. Those who tried to escape faced death on both sides, executed by their own defenders as suspected deserters or captured by Roman troops beyond the walls. Josephus, an eyewitness, described horrifying scenes of desperation, residents GNA. Josephus, an eyewitness, described horrifying scenes of desperation, residents gnawing on leather and worse. One account tells of a woman driven insane by hunger who committed an unspeakable act against her own child. By late July, Roman forces breached the Antonia fortress. What followed became one of the most catastrophic episodes of cultural destruction in human history. On August 30, 70 CE, the Second Temple was set ablaze. Jewish defenders rushed forward to save their holiest site, disregarding their own lives, while Roman soldiers either ignored or defied orders meant to preserve the structure. The temple, heart of Jewish worship and identity, was consumed by fire. Afterward, Roman troops methodically erased Jerusalem itself. Buildings were burned, walls torn down, entire districts flattened. By September, the city was nothing but ruins. Only 3 towers from Herod's palace and part of the western wall were left standing, preserved solely to demonstrate the magnitude of what Rome had conquered. Josephus claimed that more than 1 million people died, a number modern historians view as inflated. Even conservative estimates, however, place the dead in the hundreds of thousands. Mass enslavement following Judea's collapse. With Jerusalem's fall, the Romans began a ruthless process of sorting the survivors. Armed defenders and the elderly were executed outright. The rest were processed with chilling efficiency. Roughly 97,000 Jews were enslaved, not only fighters, but civilians and entire families whose only crime was belonging to a city that resisted Rome. Age determined fate. Children under 17 were separated from their families and sold into servitude across the empire, many never to reunite with their kin. The strongest survivors faced a grim combination of slavery and spectacle. Thousands were sent to the arenas, forced to battle as gladiators or torn apart by wild animals before cheering crowds. These were not swift executions, but extended displays of suffering meant to warn all who might challenge Roman authority. Some captives died in mass executions staged as mythological performances, dressed as legendary heroes only to be killed before the audience. Others were condemned to forced labor, constructing monuments that celebrated their own defeat. Jewish prisoners helped build the Forum of Peace and, most bitterly, the Colosseum itself, where many of their fellow captives would later die for public entertainment. They became the laborers of their own subjugation. The leaders of Jerusalem's resistance met grim ends. Simon Bar Giora eventually surrendered and was transported to Rome in chains. During the triumph of 71 CE, he was paraded through the streets before being taken to the Mamertine prison and executed by hanging. John of Gischala was sentenced to life imprisonment, condemned to live as a symbol of failed resistance, denied freedom and even the release of death. The enslaved population was scattered across the Roman world, shipped from Gaza to provinces stretching from Egypt to Spain. Archaeological evidence confirms this widespread dispersion, marking the beginning of a Jewish diaspora shaped by conquest, destruction, and forced exile. A tombstone discovered near Naples honors Claudia Astor, described as a captive taken from Jerusalem. The poet Martial made casual mention of possessing a Jewish slave. Such scattered references expose how completely Rome absorbed the defeated Jewish population into its imperial economy. Gruesome public executions of Jewish rebels. During the siege, Roman troops carried out acts of brutality that were both practical and psychological in design. As famine tightened its grip on Jerusalem, desperate residents attempted to flee the city in search of food beyond Roman lines. Those who were captured faced swift punishment meant to terrorize those still behind the walls. Crucifixion emerged as Rome's preferred instrument of psychological warfare. Josephus recorded that Roman soldiers crucified Jewish prisoners within full view of Jerusalem's fortifications. The scale was horrifying. At certain moments, more than 500 people were crucified each day, with executions continuing for months. Enraged by the stubborn resistance they had faced, soldiers treated these deaths as macabre amusement. Roman legionaries began fastening victims in countless variations. Some were suspended upside down. Others had their arms fixed at unnatural angles. Josephus described how soldiers entertained themselves by experimenting with new configurations of suffering. The diversity served no military purpose beyond amplifying terror and indulging the soldiers' own cruelty. Before execution, victims were scourged, their bodies torn by whips embedded with metal or bone. They were then forced to carry the crossbeam to the execution site, where they were either tied or nailed through the wrists and feet. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. A heel bone uncovered near Jerusalem in 1968 revealed a Roman nail roughly 7.5 inches long driven through both heels, its tip bent to prevent removal. Crucifixion was a slow death. The position restricted breathing, forcing victims to push upward on their pierced feet to inhale, repeating a cycle of agony that could last for hours or even days. Eventually, as Josephus noted, the Romans ran out of wood for crosses and space to erect them. The hills surrounding Jerusalem became a forest of dying bodies, visible from miles away. The intent extended far beyond execution itself. Titus understood that each crucifixion was a message directed at those still defending the city. The Romans hoped the spectacle would shatter any remaining will to resist. Even after Jerusalem fell, rebels captured elsewhere were crucified along roads throughout Judea, their bodies left on display as warnings to any community contemplating rebellion. Permanent ban on Jewish return to Jerusalem. Emperor Hadrian sought to ensure that Jerusalem would never again become a focal point for Jewish resistance. His solution was to erase its Jewish identity entirely. The city was rebuilt as Aelia Capitolina, a Roman colony whose name openly declared its new allegiance. Broad colonnaded streets, monumental gates, and forums reshaped the city's landscape. On the site where the Jewish temple had once stood, Hadrian erected a temple dedicated to Jupiter Capitolinus. A formal edict barred Jews from entering the city. This was not a temporary military measure but a permanent legal ban. Jews were forbidden from residing in or even visiting their holiest city. The prohibition was absolute, enforced by Roman authorities who viewed any Jewish presence as a threat. Only one exception was permitted, deliberately designed to reinforce defeat. Once each year, on the 9th of AV, the anniversary of the Second Temple's destruction, Jews were allowed to enter the city to mourn at what remained of the Temple Mount. This annual visit became a ritual of grief, as Jews lamented their losses while surrounded by the pagan city that had replaced Jerusalem. In the 4th century, Jerome described these scenes, noting elderly Jewish pilgrims dressed in rags, weeping over the ruins of their former glory. Hadrian also renamed the province, changing Judea to Syria Palestina. The choice was deliberate, invoking the ancient Philistines, long-standing enemies of the Jews. This was not administrative convenience but symbolic annihilation. Rome sought to sever even the geographic association between the land and its Jewish inhabitants. The consequences of this renaming endured. The name Palestine derives directly from Syria Palestina. The ban on Jewish residence in Jerusalem remained in force for centuries, continuing even after the Roman Empire adopted Christianity under Constantine. Only with the Muslim conquest in 636 CE did the prohibition finally end. By then, nearly 500 years had passed since Jews were allowed to live in their former capital. This prolonged exclusion fostered a permanent diaspora mentality. For the first time in their history, Jews became a people without a political homeland, scattered across the Roman world and beyond. Communities emerged in Spain, North Africa, Italy, Babylonia, and Arabia, preserving religious traditions while adapting to local societies. The destruction of the temple and the permanent expulsion from Jerusalem forced the development of Rabbinic Judaism, which centered religious life on study, prayer, and communal practice rather than temple sacrifice and pilgrimage. The consequences of Rome's actions in 70 and 135 CE extended far beyond immediate violence and displacement. They reshaped Jewish existence itself, transforming a people rooted in their ancestral land into a dispersed minority. This diaspora, imposed by Roman power, would define Jewish life for the next 18 centuries, ending only with the establishment of modern Israel in 1948. Which element of this catastrophe stands out as most devastating? The physical destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple, the mass enslavement and executions, or the permanent exile that followed? Rome achieved its short-term military goals, but it ultimately failed to extinguish Jewish identity, which endured across centuries of dispersion.